Welcome to English Through History. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe or leave us a review. It helps us to create more content and is appreciated by our small team here. We hope you enjoy today's episode. The 1950s were characterized by a combination of post-war recovery, economic prosperity, social change, and cultural transformation. It was an eventful era and led to major technological advances, cultural icons, and intense global division. In today's episode, we will talk about and highlight the major events that took place during this fascinating period of time. We'll divide the episode into several parts: global politics, technology, culture, and notable people. Of course, due to constraints in time and length, there were many events we couldn't cover, so apologies for missing out on anything due to this. However, many of the things we talk about here either have been or will be covered in more detail in the channel with their own specific episodes, so please keep an eye out for them. The 1950s political landscape was dominated by the fear of communism from the US and its allies, and a clear line drawn between socialism and capitalism, creating tensions between countries like the Soviet Union and China and the US and Western Europe. SEATO in 1954 was formed, and this is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and this was established as a collective defense pact to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. And this was influenced by the Truman Doctrine and the domino theory. In 1950 to 1953, conflict between North Korea, supported by China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea, supported by the United Nations, primarily the United States, broke out. This war ended in an armistice, establishing the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ. Also, the First Indochina War between France and what would become Vietnam ended in 1954 with the Geneva Accords, leading to the partition of Vietnam into North and South. In the early 1950s, we had McCarthyism. This was a period of intense anti-communist suspicion in the United States, led by the aforementioned Senator Joseph McCarthy, and this resulted in numerous accusations and investigations. This grim period in US history led to fear-mongering and eventually led to the State Department officials being accused without evidence of being communists. Many countries in Africa and Asia gained independence from colonial powers, including Ghana in 1957, and numerous others, including Libya, who gained independence from Italy in 1951, and Tunisia and Morocco, in which both countries gained independence from French colonial rule in 1956. Also notable was the Algerian War of Independence, and this continued from 1954 to 1962. And this is which the National Liberation Front, the FLN, launched a guerrilla war against French colonial rule, leading to a prolonged and a brutal conflict. In South Africa, the 1950s saw increasing resistance against the apartheid regime. The ANC and other groups organized significant campaigns such as the Defiance Campaign in 1952 and the Congress of the People, which adopted the Freedom Charter in 1955. The Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, culminated in the overthrow of the Batista regime in 1959. Although Cuba is part of the Caribbean, the revolution had a profound impact on South America. inspiring leftist movements and alarming conservative governments and the United States. Guatemala's political developments began to impact the global order. The United States then orchestrated a coup in 1954 to overthrow democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz, fearing his land reforms and perceived communist sympathies. The Chinese Civil War ended with the victory of the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong, who proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The 1950s, however, saw the implementation of radical social and economic reforms, including land redistribution and the first five-year plan that took place from 1953 to 1957. And the first five-year plan emphasized heavy industry and collectivization of agriculture, aiming to transform China into a socialist society. Culturally, the 1950s brought a change in what we consider entertainment. And more importantly, it ushered in enormous civil rights movements in the US and beyond, defining how we interact with each other. The civil rights movements in the US gained traction with two key events: Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and this is where the US Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, and the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to 1956. This was sparked by Rosa Parks' arrest, and this boycott led to a Supreme Court decision declaring segregation on public buses unconstitutional. Elvis Presley made his debut in 1956. He became a major influence on the music scene and youth culture. This led to the rise of rock and roll music, with figures like Elvis Presley becoming cultural icons. Alongside this, television became a dominant form of entertainment and information, with shows like I Love Lucy and The Ed Sullivan Show gaining massive popularity. The 1950s was an era of technology, emerging as the decade that set the groundwork for some of the most important scientific breakthroughs of our time. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite called Sputnik 1, marking the beginning of the space race. Quickly after, in 1958, the United States launched its first satellite in response to Sputnik. This was called Explorer 1. In 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk developed the first successful polio vaccine, which became widely available and significantly reduced the incidence of polio. Development and testing of hydrogen bombs by both the United States and the Soviet Union changed the potential of nuclear weapons and escalated the arms race. The UK developed its own nuclear weapons, successfully testing its first atom bomb in 1952 and its first hydrogen bomb in 1957, becoming only the third country to possess such weapons after the USA and the USSR. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick, with contributions from Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins, discovered the double helix structure of DNA. This groundbreaking discovery laid the foundation for modern genetics and biotechnology. The de Havilland Comet, introduced in 1952, was the world's first commercial jet airliner, revolutionizing air travel by significantly reducing flight times and increasing passenger capacity. The Boeing 707, introduced in 1958, further advanced commercial aviation. IBM also introduced its first commercial computer, the IBM 701 in 1952, followed by the IBM 650 in 1954. These computers were widely adapted for scientific and business applications, significantly advancing the computer industry. And finally, there were many people who were consequential in the 1950s. Here are just a few of them. Dwight D. Eisenhower. He served as the 34th President of the United States from 1953 to 1961. Nikita Khrushchev. He rose to power in the Soviet Union after the death of Joseph Stalin, 1953. Marilyn Monroe became one of the most famous actresses and sex symbols of the decade. James Dean symbolized the rebellious youth culture before his untimely death in 1955. And finally, Mao Zedong, Chinese dictator that emerged from a brutal civil war and changed the country entirely.